Hello everybody and welcome back to OMB Reviews. I am the critic who is a cynic. Hope you're doing well, and today we're doing a review for Thor, Love and Thunder, which I just finished watching. And yeah, I have a lot of thoughts about the movie. Some good things to say about the film, a lot of bad things to say about the film as well. As you all know, I will always try to be as upfront and honest in my reviews of any films, whether I have a, let's just say, whether I have a positive outlook of the company that made the film or the person that made the film or not. And despite whatever stuff has been said about said film prior to its release. So I'm going to try and be as objective as I possibly can, but also, of course, giving you my own opinion on the film as well. Before going any further, though, please make sure that you smash that like button, line up that fire button if you're watching over on Odyssey, and also make sure that you are subscribed to the channel with that bell notification. That way you know every time the video or live stream goes live on the channel. So Thor, Love and Thunder. This is the follow-up to Taika Waititi's Thor 3, which was Thor Ragnarok. And as I've been made very clear on this channel several times, I am one that actually found Thor Ragnarok to be quite entertaining. I had a lot of fun with it. I know that not everyone feels the same way when it comes to that movie. Some thought that it did a little bit too much with the jokes, made Thor a little bit of a joke in and of himself, didn't really make you take him as seriously. Also, it made any of the stakes that the film tried to build up really not mean much of anything, because every time things got super serious, all of a sudden there was a random joke, which kind of, deflated any of the tension whatsoever. What I can say is that this film does the exact same thing. This film is no different than Ragnarok in that respect. And so if you hated that about Ragnarok, you're not going to like this film either, because it does that, and it does it even more so. I think there were so many more jokes in this film, most of which just didn't really stick, or really didn't, stick the landing. Maybe a couple of them were chuckle-worthy, but because it was just jokes so often, especially in proximity to a little bit more serious of some of the scenes that were a little bit more serious, it definitely, again, has that jarring effect where you're thinking to yourself, okay, things are starting to finally get really, down to business, down to brass tacks, and then all of a sudden, oh, we're going to crack another joke here. Korg's going to say something really funny, or blah, blah, blah. And I think that it's something that, again, it is a type of comedy that some people will like. It's a type of comedy that other people will, I think, obviously, hate. As far as the things that I could say positively at the film, though, before totally ragging on the movie for its story, because there's a lot to say as far as the story is concerned. One of the really good things that I liked about the film is actually the character of Gorr. I thought that the Gorr, the God Butcher, played by Bale, I thought it was very compellingly played. I thought that he did a pretty good job in his performance, and I thought that they handled his story, his origin story, I think, pretty well. That was actually one of my favorite parts of the film, was the very beginning, where they go into who Gorr is and his origin story and where he becomes the God Butcher and why he has such a hatred of the gods themselves that are portrayed in this film. And so I thought that that was actually kind of interesting of a concept, and I wish that they had done a little bit more with that, to be honest. I thought that they did a lot with it, but they could have done a lot more, and it was really the only serious time. It was really the only serious storyline other than the Jane Foster one, but that one, of course, had also tons of random jokes in it, which didn't make it, you take it nearly as seriously as it actually was. But with Gorr the God Butcher, they actually had a lot more of a serious take, and I thought, man, this is something that they should have really upheld throughout the entirety of the film. And even though Gorr is not really cracking all these kinds of jokes, they definitely have a couple of scenes where they ask Christian Bale to perform in such a way which is over the top to the point of absurdity, and it does take away a little bit from that character. So I did like, for the most part, the character of Gorr, especially his origin story. There's also some really cool sequences that happen, or one really cool sequence that happens on one of these planets that exist within the framework of the film. And it's in a complete black and white sequence, and I thought that that actually looked really, really good. As far as cinematography is concerned, I do like when they play on those black and whites in that capacity. The other cinematography in the film was fine. It was okay. It does suffer from those typical quick cuts that you see in a lot of the modern-day action films, especially the modern-day action superhero films, comic book films that come from the MCU. But I thought that it was at the very least serviceable. It wasn't that distracting, or all that distracting. It didn't have a lot of excessive shaky cam, for instance, so at least it doesn't have that. But overall, that cinematography wasn't all that bad. The only other thing that I really enjoyed about this movie was the soundtrack. I thought that the song choices were great. This is something that I think a lot of us expected to happen when you have Taika Waititi, who has shown himself to have pretty good taste when it comes to musical choices in his films. We already knew that he had that capacity. He does that even more so in this film. There are a crap ton of rock and roll, classic 80s rock and roll songs that are in this movie, and you obviously just have fun listening to them because they're fun songs. You're like, oh man, I really enjoy this movie, or rather I really enjoy this song, and then you also remind yourself, but wait a minute, we're in this movie and they're trying to convey certain emotions, and okay, what's going on screen, and does it make sense within the framework of what they're trying to actually present? And that's when you really start to realize, okay, the soundtrack is fun. You look at the character of Gorr and you say, okay, that's kind of fun. You have jokes throughout. Some of them land, some of them don't. I personally have always been a pretty big fan of the character of Korg. I thought Korg was really funny in Thor Ragnarok. But when you really get into the actual story itself, it is just a giant hot mess. When you look back to Ragnarok had those elements of comedy where it did distract you. It did take you out of the seriousness of the scenario. It did make it difficult to take those different elements seriously. But because it was much more tempered compared to this movie, it is one where I, at least for me, am able to get through that film, and I think that it has a rewatchability to it. You get to this movie, and I honestly don't see how this film can really be all that rewatchable because there's no stakes really in the film itself. Any of the stakes that they do try to present become cannon fodder, comedy fodder, essentially, for random jokes to be said. Or they end up resulting in something where you're like, oh, there really was no stake at all because what we thought really bad happened here to this specific character ended up not really being that bad at all. And, oh, okay, they're totally fine now. It's basically no stakes whatsoever. And I think that is one of the most difficult things that the MCU is going to have going forward. Not only is the MCU just become so bland, so boring, so formulaic in a lot of its movies, I will say that Taika Waititi, if he has anything going for him, is that he does have his own unique stamp on the MCU, whether you like it or not. Right, I think a lot more people that I know at least hate that style that he has, but there are a lot of people that like it too. At least it's unique. At least it's different in many ways than some of the other MCU films, though it does still have that basic formulaic structure of most MCU films. The biggest problem, though, for this film and for the MCU going forward is that there really are no stakes. And so when you get to your post-credit scenes, which of course they have them in this movie because MCU has to have them now, and they set up for future films, you think to yourself, why should I even care? Why should I care who the next big bad is? Or why should I care who the next villain for this specific character is? Why should I care about any of that when all I know is that whatever the film's going to be, they're going to come out on top, or if they don't come out on top, they're just going to end up being replaced, and it's just going to continue moving forward, right? It's come to the point now where the MCU has become so gigantic, has become so full of itself, basically, right? Kevin Feige, in this case, Taika Waititi, have become so full of themselves that they feel like we can just do anything that we want forever, and people are going to keep on going to see the movies. And hey, box office seems to be indicating that that is the case. Doctor Strange 2 made over $950 million at the box office. Thor Love and Thunder is projected to, at this rate, make somewhere between $650 and $750. We'll have to wait and see what the actual numbers are. It did make $29 million yesterday, so that's a pretty strong opening night, pretty strong Thursday night preview opening, I should say. And it is, even though behind where Doctor Strange 2's box office opening was, it is still within contention of previous installments of Thor. So we'll be following those numbers as they come out. But it's regardless of that, we look to the story, we look to the actual structure of the film itself. And again, I think it is a commentary on the entirety of the MCU itself, where at some point they've got to realize that it's fine to have comedy, right? It's fine to have that sense of levity. These are comic stories. But at some point, you got to pull the reins back, and you have to start creating stakes, or just to end the story altogether. Now, they're not going to end the story altogether because there's too much money to be had in that, even though I think more and more MCU fans are starting to wake up saying, okay, yeah, it's just the same thing over and over and over and over again. Maybe it's time for me to step out. Maybe it's time for me just to stop caring about any of these characters because there's really no investment. There's really no need for it, right? Endgame was very much the endgame, I think, for a lot of people. But back to the movie itself, you do have performances from Chris Hemsworth, which is fine. Christian Bale is good. Tessa Thompson is Tessa Thompson in the film. You also, of course, have the big elephant in the room, which a lot of us have talked about since the trailer release, which is the introduction of Jane Foster Thor, female Thor. And this might be a bit of a spoiler, simply because it's a line that's mentioned. But to me, it kind of shows you just the hubris of Taika Waititi and the hubris of Disney's MCU in the line, because it very clearly was directed towards fans. It was directed towards people who were critical of the trailer, people who were critical of the story, people who were critical of this iteration of the character, which just doesn't make any sense whatsoever within the context and the framework that they have established within both comics and also within the films themselves. And that is, you have at one point at the very end Gorr fighting Jane Foster's Thor, and calls her Lady Thor. And then so she gets mad and says, it's not Lady Thor. If you're gonna call me anything, it's Mighty Thor, or at least Dr. Jane Foster. It was such an on the nose moment that to me was just so petty from them. It's just such a petty line that you just know they threw that in there to say, oh, everyone calling her female Thor. Remember when the first announcement came out, they were already freaking out because people were saying female Thor, female Thor. It's like, it's not female Thor, it's Mighty Thor. They put that into the movie. And so at that point, I'm like, oh my goodness, are you serious? Are you serious right now? Are you kidding me? But this is the type of nonsense that they are pushing into their films. And that's just one of the many other things that they push in. There's a lot of identity politics stuff in the film. There's a whole subplot with Korg basically becoming gay. Again, there's all of these different elements that are being thrown in where you're just like, okay, you're just becoming so egregious with it. It's just becoming so straightforward. Your agenda is clearly showing, and it's just getting very, very old. In a movie like this, where they could have done so much more, you had a really cool villain in Gorr the God Butcher. You could have gone in a lot of really great directions with it, and instead you just treat him like you do almost any other villain. Just in the future, in the previous installments of Thor and in general. And in the end, you're just like, okay, whatever. It's just generic MCU films now at this point with way too much comedy, no stakes whatsoever, and a message that's just becoming so much more apparent and so much more obvious that it's just become to the point of it getting incredibly boring. And so overall, I looked at this movie and I said, okay, you got the soundtrack, awesome. You've got an interesting concept, underneath it all. But in the end, what you have is a pretty giant mess of a movie that doesn't take itself seriously enough. And even though comedies are, notorious for doing that, when you have an MCU film that almost goes too far with its comedy and to the point of it mocking itself for the most part, how are fans supposed to feel about that? Yeah, you might have them enjoy the film when they first go to see it, but they're not going to want to see it again, most likely. And they're not going to be like, oh yeah, you have to go see this film. It's amazing. It's fantastic. So with all that being said, I'm going to go ahead and give this film a C-. I give it a C- again because that soundtrack. I think that the soundtrack is a lot of fun. And also, I do think that the character of Gorr, played by Christian Bale, despite the fact Christian Bale is a pretty despicable person in real life anyway, I do think that that was something that was at the very least interesting and compelling, to say the least. There are some other moments in the film, too, where I'm like, oh, that's an interesting concept. That's a pretty interesting concept. But it's also one where I'm like, yeah, but I don't really desire or have any desire whatsoever to go back and rewatch it and to try to follow through with those moments or have any hope or desire that they're going to follow through with them in the future, because there's things that they do in the film that just don't make any sense whatsoever, are not consistent with the previous storylines whatsoever, and just become just downright stupid. I mean, that's where really this film is just really stupid. And I know a C- might seem generous for this movie, and maybe it is. Maybe over the course of me thinking about it more and talking about it, I might go down to that, that D+ level, which is where a lot of these MCU films have stuck at this point. But I do think that I look to the grade that I gave to Doctor Strange 2, which was a D+, and I think, well, I definitely enjoyed this film more than Doctor Strange 2. That doesn't mean that it's a good film, and I would definitely not recommend going to see this film in any capacity whatsoever. Anyway, those are my thoughts, mostly spoiler-free stuff. So what are y'all's thoughts about this? Obviously, there's a lot more stuff that I could go into, which I think kind of make you realize, oh, yeah, there's a lot more to complain about, and there's a lot more to be critical of, but those are just the main thoughts that came out of my head right after seeing the film. So what are y'all's thoughts? Have you seen Thor: Love and Thunder? Do you think it's going to be a box office hit? Do you think that it's not going to be a box office hit? Did you like it? Did you not? Let me know in the comment section down below. If you liked this video, smash that like button, slap that fire button on Odyssey. Y'all all amazing and beautiful people. Hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day. Taika Waititi, you are so full of yourself at this point, man, and you had such great potential in your directorial career. I think back to what you do in the shadows, what we do in the shadows, which I thought was a lot of fun, and now you become almost so full of yourself to the point where it's your ego that's on display here. It becomes a character in a lot of ways. And so, anyway, with all that being said, have a wonderful rest of your day, everybody. And as always, God bless. And now for a huge special shout out to my July Patreon Subscribe Star and Locals members at the Keeper of the Bifrost level and above. First starting off with Brandon, let's go Brandon, Chris from the 80s, who you can check out over on YouTube, Garrett Searles, Heimir Ari Hymason, Jeff Toon, Joe Horn, Jonathan Carney, Laura, the Modern Major General Story, Father, Luca Illick, Orange Hat Reviews, who you can also check out over on his YouTube channel as well. Congrats on recently getting to 1,000 subscribers. Rosetta Allen, who you can also find on YouTube as well. Stan Andrian and Miss Martin Muses, who also has her own YouTube channel. Thank you all very much for supporting me over on the platform of Patreon. We also have my Subscribe Star members, Matt317, Storm Tracker, The R, Fast Reaction, John B, Mr. Roy, Glinzer, J. Alice McCarthy Jr., shout out to you, good sir, and continue that awesome recovery that you are doing. Dean Heiss, J-Rod, the Beer Guru, and ZK-Man. ZK-Man, you can find out over and follow him on Twitter as well. And we also have my Locals members. We have of course, the lovely and amazing Minnesota hockey fan. How about a hockey player? UAB UAB Mad Dog, Mike Jackson for the win, and Robert Barnes, as well as Brett D90. Thank you very much. And my last supporter, of course, is the amazing Tina B, Empress of the Universe, one of my mods on the channel. Check out her new show with my other Valkyrie, Stephanie B, on her channel, Tina B's channel, which is called Soup to Nuts. Go check that out because it is pretty awesome and fun content. Anyway, that is going to be it for all of my Keeper of the Bifrost level members and above. If you want your name shout out at the end of every video and live stream, please make sure that you check out the top link of the video description. It is w.lo, the Willow link, as I like to call it, and you can find my Patreon, Subscribe Star, etc., where you can get not only shout outs, but also access to an exclusive podcast that I do with John the Flick Pick Flickinger every single month, and also access to giveaways of Blu-rays, 4Ks, etc., all that good stuff. Check that out in the video description. You guys are all amazing and beautiful people. Hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day, and as always, God bless.